Okay, listen to this quote. If you can communicate in those means, speaking, writing, and if you can think, you are so powerful that nothing can stop you. Just think about that for a second. The ultimate human superpower, right? It isn't physical strength. It's not immense wealth. It is literally just your ability to articulate your thoughts. So in today's explainer, we're unpacking a really fascinating psychological roadmap pulled directly from our source material. We're going to explore how developing your mind, understanding your own neurobiology, and voluntarily taking on really heavy burdens can absolutely transform your life.
Welcome to the Explainer. Today's deep dive is titled The Architecture of Responsibility. We're breaking down a compelling framework that moves us from a state of total internal chaos to a life of profound meaning. It's a journey that, honestly, challenges a lot of our modern assumptions about what it actually means to be a functional, successful human being.
So, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the sheer power of articulation. Second, the biology of motivation. Third, integrating your inner shadow. And finally, the ultimate antidote to chaos.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, the power of articulation, which is essentially your psychological weapon.
Our source argues that articulation is without a doubt our primary tool for navigating reality. Consider this stark contrast. On one hand, you have the naive victim. This is someone who is totally inarticulate. And if you can't express yourself, well, you can't negotiate for a raise, you can't defend your boundaries, and you are entirely vulnerable to the inevitable tragedies of life. But look at the alternative. The articulate leader is formidable. They can lay out a perfectly reasonable argument. They don't have to rely on temper tantrums or impulsive aggression because they can negotiate their way to a sustainable, productive peace.
And this brilliantly illustrates why articulation is so vital. A word isn't just a random collection of letters on a page. As the source notes, a word is an ancient artifact. It's almost like a living entity with its own evolutionary history, existing within a vast ecosystem of meaning. When you learn to pull words apart, like parsing through Shakespeare or breaking down a really complex legal document, you are mastering an ancient evolutionary tool that literally allows you to structure reality itself, which brings us to how we actually acquire these words, and that is through reading. Our source points out that reading allows you to totally bypass the school of hard knocks. You don't have to get punched in the face by life repeatedly to learn a lesson. You can sit down with a book and effectively download 30 years of a brilliant thinker's hard-earned wisdom in just 6 months. I mean, that is an incredible, almost unfair advantage.
Okay, moving right along to part 2, the biology of motivation or the engine of seeking.
To really understand what drives us physically, we have to look at something called reward prediction error. The source explains that dopamine is so often misunderstood. People think it's just the pleasure chemical, right? But it's actually about anticipation. Dopamine peaks when you are anticipating a reward. But here is the major catch. If you generate hope for a goal, and then that expectation fails, your dopamine doesn't just quietly go back to normal. No, it drops below baseline. It crashes.
Let's break down this engine a bit more. Dopamine is basically the universal currency of our reality. It drives seeking behavior. Right now, your prefrontal cortex is constantly generating possible future paths. The source actually shares this fascinating anecdote about losing a piece of paper that had a planned ritual written on it, right out on the beach. When the paper was lost, the internal simulation failed, causing a severe emotional crash. It was essentially a self-punishment for a failed anticipation. But the moment the paper was found, the system immediately rebooted. We are literally biologically wired to suffer when our simulated futures collapse.
$50,000. Now, this isn't just a random number thrown out there. It's a staggering mathematical reality check about your own potential. Think about it like this. If you waste just 4 hours a day, maybe you're inefficiently studying or doom-scrolling social media until your eyes just glaze over, that adds up to 20 hours a week. If your future time is worth just $50 an hour, you are burning $50,000 a year in deferred wages. Sitting on the fence, failing to aim at a specific goal, doesn't mean you just stay neutral. It guarantees that you are quietly torching your own youthful potential, day by day, hour by hour.
All right, part 3, integrating the inner shadow, the controlled monster.
Shifting gears into deep psychology, the goal here isn't actually to be a harmless person. Let's look at a classic mythological comparison brought up in the source material. On one hand, you have Peter Pan. He represents immature, chaotic potential. He absolutely refuses to grow up because, well, growing up means taking on a burden. But look at the alternative presented in the story, Captain Hook. He's the tyrannical, resentful adult who is absolutely terrified of the ticking crocodile, which of course represents the ticking clock of death. Both of these are failed paths. One avoids responsibility entirely, while the other is completely corrupted by fear and resentment. And this brilliantly illustrates the actual solution. The source reinterprets that ancient idea that the meek shall inherit the earth. Being meek doesn't mean being a total pushover. The actual translation is closer to those who have swords and know exactly how to use them, but deliberately choose to keep them sheathed will inherit the world.
So the absolutely crucial point here is this. Weakness is not moral virtue. If you are entirely harmless, you aren't peaceful, you're just weak. You're basically a victim waiting to happen. To be genuinely good, the source argues that you must integrate your inner shadow, your inner monster. You literally have to be capable of being dangerous. You have to grow teeth. But, and this is the key, you must keep that capacity strictly and consciously under control. That active, deliberate self-control is where true morality actually lies.
Finally, we hit part 4, the antidote to chaos, voluntary responsibility.
So, how do we actually apply all of this heavy theory to the everyday chaos of our lives? Well, the source suggests a hyper-practical, deeply humbling starting point. Step 1. Sit on the edge of your bed tonight. Step 2. Genuinely ask yourself, what is one stupid thing I am doing wrong that I could fix, and that I would actually fix? And step 3. Go do it. Seriously, it might literally just be cleaning your room. Because if you can't even organize your own immediate, physical space, how on earth can you expect to reorganize your life, let alone society?
And the crazy thing is, this micro-action scales up rapidly. You might think you're just a tiny speck of dust among billions of people, but the framework argues the exact opposite. You are a node in a vast network. You'll likely know 1,000 people in your lifetime, and they will each know 1,000 people. You're only 2 connections away from 1 billion. So when you take responsibility and put your own life in order, it ripples outward like a stone dropped in a pond. Your actions, and your failures to act, matter far, far more than you think.
Ultimately, you are faced with a choice between 2 distinct paths. You can choose meaningless suffering, where you take on absolutely no responsibility, you chase impulsive pleasures, and ultimately you just suffer from existential dread and bitterness when the inevitable tragedies of life hit. Or you can choose the meaningful burden, where you adopt maximum voluntary responsibility, aim at a truly noble goal, and use that heavy weight to ground yourself.
The source is incredibly clear on this point. What you want to do is burden yourself with so much responsibility that you can barely stand. I know, it sounds totally counterintuitive, right? But the argument is that by lifting that heavy load voluntarily, you become incredibly strong. You stop obsessing over what the meaning of life is because the meaning becomes self-evident in that noble struggle to reduce suffering in the world around you.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. We know sitting on the fence guarantees failure. We know articulation gives you true power, and we know voluntary burden gives you meaning. So ask yourself right now, what would actually happen if you stopped wasting your time? What would happen if you stopped avoiding the very things you know you should do? What would happen if you were just all in? Think about that question. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer today, and I'll see you next time.